Marissa and Catherine, thank you both. And if you haven't seen those films, The Social Dilemma and People You May Know, I have seen them both and I recommend them to you. We're going to move on to our second panel now on regulation and oversight of social media. We have a fantastic slate of individuals here to discuss. Let me introduce our panel first of all. Damian Collins is co-chair of the International Grand Committee on Disinformation. He's a member of the House of Commons in the UK as well. Also with us is Michael Chertoff. He is co-chair of the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. He is CEO of the Chertoff Group. He also is a former Secretary of Homeland Security in the US. We also have Tanit Koch, who is a member also of the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. She is a former managing director of the German TV channel NTV, editor-in-chief of the Central Newsroom of NTI, and also was a former editor-in-chief of Bild. Joining us on the witness side, we have Dr. Werner Stengg. He is the senior advisor on platform regulation and disinformation in the cabinet of Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager of the European Commission. Also with us is the Right Honorable Jeremy Wright, QC, a member of the House of Commons in the UK and a former Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. And finally with us as a witness is John Samples. He is Vice President of the Cato Institute and a member of the Facebook Oversight Board. Tanit, let me turn it over to you.
So in this session, we actually want to take a very close look at some of the attempts, some of the drafts, some of the proposals at hand regarding content moderation in particular. Our witnesses, same procedure as in session number one, we start with an introductory statement of 5 minutes each and provide concrete testimony on the issue based on their first-hand experiences and their knowledge. The joint panel will then follow up into rounds of questions to deepen some of the key aspects, but as we've discussed before, feel free to jump in anytime because it'll make the discussion a lot more lively, we think. Let me just share for our audience, the guiding questions for your opening statements, which go as follows. First question, do you believe that it is possible to make illegal online that which is illegal offline? Second question, what are the concrete approaches by your government or institution for content moderation of social media platforms? And thirdly, how does your governments or institutions approach balance freedom of speech versus content regulation? I'd suggest we start with Brussels and then move west geographically. So I'm handing over to Werner Stengg to set us off with his first introductory statement.
Yeah, thank you very much and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you also for inviting us here. 5 minutes, quite a challenge because we're talking about 20 years of attempts to regulate this. As we are preparing our new laws on the matter, we are still having a framework in place that is 20 years old, the e-commerce directive, which was not, there were no social media at that time. So the only thing that you would find there is sort of the liability safe harbor a la European. It's not quite the same as in the US. But sort of still suggests that a platform is not liable for content hosted and uploaded by third parties if they have no knowledge of such content, but once they obtain knowledge, they have to act if they want to stay protected from liability. Now, in our proposal for the Digital Services Act, which we made before Christmas, but which will still take 1.5 years to be negotiated, we are turning this round and we are saying we're not changing the liability framework, but we're introducing due diligence requirements for platforms, including social media, meaning that they have to put systems in place that should reassure us on the one hand that illegal content is removed, not harmful content. The legal requirement is on illegal content of whatever kind, could be an unsafe product, could be hate speech, could be terrorist propaganda, but it's got to be illegal. If it's illegal, they have to put systems in place, notice and take down procedures, allow users to notify such content and remove such content expeditiously. But the second thing is that part of their procedures is there to secure the protection of legal content? So that's the third question, actually. We want both. We want illegal content to be removed, but we want safeguards in terms of transparency, in terms of redress possibilities for anybody whose content has been removed to get back to the platform and to demonstrate that the content had not been illegal in the first place. So it's all about the checks and balances. It's a lot about transparency. And here the transparency in the Digital Services Act extends beyond the illegal content. It also covers any type of content, including harmful content, disinformation about COVID or whatever it is, where we are still predominantly working with a voluntary framework. We have the code of practice in place with the platforms, where they are invited and have committed to taking measures to fight harmful but not necessarily illegal content, the disinformation agenda. The two are intrinsically linked, because the DSA will provide some legal backstop for the voluntary code of practice, because it will introduce transparency requirements that make it easier actually to verify to what extent voluntary measures taken in line with the code of practice are actually also implemented. So it's a transparency framework. At the same time, if a platform adheres to the principle of the code of practice, that will be considered as effective risk management in the overall content moderation systems. So that is a bit the outline. Just one comment still on can be what is illegal offline also be enforced online. Well, we think it has to be, because otherwise the ultimate trust in the online ecosystem will not work anymore. If people buying online, for instance, cannot be sure that our safety product standards are being complied with, that is going to backfire. So we are really working in terms of beefing up our enforcement and implementation systems to make exactly sure that what is illegal offline will also be removed online. And I think with that, I was sticking to 5 minutes.
Oh, you definitely did. Thank you very much. Werner Stengg, Senior Advisor in Platforms and Disinformation to EU Commissioner Vestager's cabinet. And now we'll head not to London, but to, I think it was Warwickshire, where Jeremy Wright is currently based. Please share your thoughts with us.
Thank you, Tanit. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be able to join you. Let me start with the first question. So is it possible to make illegal online what is illegal offline? And like Dr. Stengg, my answer is yes, and it has to be yes. As a legislator, as a parent, and as a citizen, my starting point in all of this is to say it cannot be right that consequences of bad behavior or protections for the vulnerable among us that are available in other environments are simply not available online. And that's especially true if we're going to live more and more of our lives online, as clearly we are. And so it's in the interest, not just of all of us, I think, but of the online companies, that the online world is a safer place and is seen as a safer place. Many of those companies have a business model that expects us to do and spend more time online. We will only do that if we feel safe there. So it's in everyone's interests that we should. Now, we're going to talk a lot about freedom of speech this afternoon, and freedom of speech is hugely important online as it is everywhere else. And one of the guiding principles of any regulatory approach we adopt should be to preserve and protect freedom of speech. For example, in the UK approach that I'll say a bit more about in a moment, journalism will be exempted from the legislative structures that we seek to put in place. But I think it's worth saying that free speech is not and never has been absolute. In the freest countries in the world, there are restrictions. You cannot say whatever you like on broadcast media. You can't say whatever you like in print media, and you can't say whatever you like on the street. Your freedom of speech is confined by the criminal law. For example, threatening violence or harassment is not permitted, or indeed by other restrictions, whether that's to protect decency or the sensitivities of children, for example. And it seems to me the same should be true online. Now, of course, getting that balance right is hard, but it's hard in every environment, and that doesn't mean we simply decline to try. We are, of course, protecting the freedom of speech, not only of those who wish to say something controversial, but also the freedom of speech of those who may be affected by others' speech and who may be intimidated from contributing their own free speech if they are. So if we have to do something about online regulation, and I believe we do, the next question is, of course, what should we do? Well, let me perhaps say something briefly about the principles that in the UK the government is seeking to apply. The first is that there has to be external regulation. It cannot be right that self-regulation by platforms continues, and to be fair, many of the platforms themselves accept that. The second principle that the UK will seek to apply is that that regulation should be based on a duty of care for online platforms to keep the users of their services as safe as they reasonably can. And that's rather than a detailed list of harms and a prescriptive list of ways in which those harms should be responded to, which I think would become out of date very, very quickly. The second thing to keep in mind is that that regulation has to be balanced and it has to be realistic. The word reasonably in the duty of care, the obligation to keep your users as safe as you reasonably can, is very important. And I say that as a lawyer, but also because I think it's crucial to understand the way in which this duty of care should be framed. It should not be the case that if a single piece of harmful content reaches a single vulnerable user, that automatically demonstrates a breach of the duty of care. That wouldn't be balanced, and it wouldn't, in my view, be realistic. The next point of interest, I think, is that there has to be an independent regulator with the capacity to analyze platforms' systems and indeed their algorithms. And the regulator needs to have the sanctions available to it in order for it to be taken seriously. All of this, of course, requires legislation. And with a wonderful piece of timing, about 3.5 hours ago, the legislative programme for the forthcoming year or so in the UK government was presented in our Queen's speech. And this bill, the Online Safety Bill, will be part of that programme. Now, that is not a perfect piece of legislation, I anticipate. None of us have seen the detail yet, but I'm sure that we will want to improve it. But let me say one final thing, and that is that it doesn't matter how good your legislation is. It doesn't matter how good your regulation is. You also need to have some education. And media literacy, the capacity to keep yourself safe online, is an important thing for any citizen to have. And it's important that whatever we do in regulation or legislation, we make sure that that education component is also available. I'll leave it there. I hope that's roughly 5 minutes.
That is definitely roughly 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Jeremy. I think the aspect of duty of care will definitely stick with us. And now let's turn to our third witness. John Samples in, I think it is Washington.
I'm actually right in the middle of Silicon Valley, which
even better, even better.
Well, it matters less than you might think, with everything shut down still. So let me just briefly describe my situation, because I think it's rather different than other witnesses. I work at a think tank in Washington, but I also work as a member of the oversight board set up by Facebook. Facebook, through certain incorporation statutes in America, has set up a board to oversee its content moderation. That board is independent of Facebook through various legal structures. So I can speak a little bit about some of these questions about Facebook. I'll speak briefly about them. For example, Facebook has a policy of that they observe local laws throughout the world, where there are 2 billion or 3 billion users, depending on who you listen to. So they have a policy of making, they observe local laws, so they would not, illegal stuff would not be protected. But there's also the question of the burden sharing between platforms and government. The United States is somewhat different, as you know. The First Amendment applies only to government action, not private entities. So Facebook is not covered by the First Amendment. At the same time, the National Legislature in the United States has granted platforms broad protections against being liable for what's said on the platform and how the platform is governed through content moderations. And of course, as always, Facebook managers have an obligation to maximize shareholder value, which in turn, I think, has fostered a desire to seek independent review of content moderation. So what's our concrete approach and mandate at the Oversight Board? The Oversight Board is charged with making binding decisions regarding Facebook content moderation. And what this means is, for example, in the case of Mr. Donald Trump, the former president, when his account was suspended on January 6th, Facebook asked us if that was, given some sources of authority that I'm going to talk about, they ask us, was that acceptable or not? So that the binding decisions we make tend to be an up or down decision, a yes or no decision. We also have the authority under our charter to issue non-binding decisions related to recommending policy or things that grow out of a particular case. So again, in Mr. Trump's case, you see there's about maybe 5 or 6 or more recommendations for changing Facebook policies. Now, what are the sources of this oversight, this making these binding decisions and policy recommendations? There are 3: the community standards of Facebook and whether they've been applied correctly, Facebook values, which are above all the paramount values described as voice, which we might think of as freedom of expression, and then finally, perhaps the most innovative one, international human rights norms. So how do we balance freedom of speech versus content regulation? Here, I think the international human right norm of Article 19 in the ICCPR offers robust protection for expression and sets standards also for limiting expression. So again, we shouldn't pursue a sense, I agree, a sense of that there's absolute free speech somewhere. Article 19 doesn't provide for that. What it does do is make it harder and more disciplined to actually limit freedom of speech. So the Oversight Board has followed the UN Special Rapporteur and applied a tripartite test to test limits on voice by Facebook. Is it legal? Is it vague? Is it take the form of law? Is it a legitimate goal? And then the question of necessity and proportionality. Necessity being understood as the least restrictive means are being used by Facebook to attain a legitimate goal. Now, I will finish by saying, insofar as balancing implies choosing among public values that are equal in weight, and it's sometimes interpreted that way, the Oversight Board does not balance speech and other values. Voice as a value has a preferred, though far from absolute, position in our work. And to limit voice or expression, Facebook must carry a stringent burden of proof. To avoid any confusion, I will note that much of the community standards that we apply and Facebook applies would not pass muster under the First Amendment. This is not a First Amendment standard, and that's because Facebook was free under American law and under the Constitution to decide on its own approach, and the Oversight Board is part of that.
Thank you very much, John. I think all our witness statements are, as was already mentioned in the first session, especially interesting within the context of this year's Democracy Perception Index. In Europe, we have 40% versus 14% of respondents who believe that we need more content regulation on social media. In the US, that's 36% versus 21% in favor of more regulation. And with this in mind, I'd like to give the floor to my fellow colleagues on the joint panel who have 5 minutes each. But as said, we won't absolutely stick to all those housekeeping rules, to provide their brief observations on the issue. And then we ask the witnesses a few targeted questions. So please, Damian, we are all ears.
Thank you very much. It's great to be with you. And as my colleague Jeremy Wright has said, it's good timing from a UK point of view, because I believe the online safety bill will be published tomorrow. So we'll then be able to look at the specific details of the proposals. But I think that the key thing is as Jeremy in particular set out in his remarks, is that we find ourselves in a position where, because of the central role in the lives of millions of people, billions of people, that the internet plays and social media plays, that it's become important that we understand what goes on there, and that to have a system of content moderation or a system of regulation oversight of social media, which is largely based on self-declared reports and information from the companies themselves, appears now to be inadequate to the problems that we face. If you're looking at an individual bit of content that's been posted, you know it's been posted, you can screen grab it, you can have an example of it, you can make a decision as to whether that piece of content is in breach of the terms and conditions, terms of service of that company or not. But if you want to understand, well, in this case, was the problem not just so much that this piece of content was created, but the way in which it was boosted and amplified through a complex network of accounts? How do you find out information about that? Because we know that disinformation, hate speech, harmful content has always existed. The concern we have in society today is that social media has done two things. It's often made it harder to know who the source is, the identity of them, where they're based, and therefore we might need to rely on the systems of social media companies to gather that information so that if content's been posted that is already a breach of the law, the law enforcement agencies could take some action against them. But there is a second issue around amplification. Actually, was the harm caused in part by the person that posted harmful content and material online, but also potentially by the systems of that social media company that have amplified it and boosted it and even recommended it to people. And we know in the case of Facebook that Facebook have seen that their recommendation tools have directed users towards extremist content and material on their site. And we saw in the case of the Facebook Oversight Board's analysis of the Donald Trump case that they quite rightly asked to see information relating to whether Facebook had boosted and amplified the Stop the Steal campaign, the incitement to come to the Save America rally in Washington, the incitement that may have caused people to behave in a violent way. And Facebook declined to provide any of that information to the Oversight Board. And I think that we have to ask ourselves a question whether that is good enough. And actually, one of the questions I think should have been asked, or should be asked about the decision about the suspension of Donald Trump's accounts, is not should they have been suspended when they were, but could Facebook have intervened earlier? And therefore, and by intervening earlier, taken action earlier, maybe prevented the what would appear to be a type of insurrection taking place in the first place. Is it okay on Facebook to plan an insurrection, to invite people to an insurrection, but it only becomes a matter for Facebook when violence breaks out on the day? And therefore, I think that's why we need to have a system of robust independent regulation that can challenge companies in this way to understand what the problems are. I agree with Jeremy Wright that to believe that through legislation you can create a perfect system where nothing bad will ever be posted, everything will always be taken down immediately, is not possible. But what we need to build in is some sort of responsibility for the companies that operate these systems, that they do act thoroughly and fairly in an appropriate way, and there's a sanction against them when they don't. And they can be investigated when we think something has clearly gone wrong, and not be able to hide information from those investigating authorities. And I think if we're going to add questions to the end of our opening remarks, I think that's the kind. I just wanted to ask John what your view was about this question around amplification on Facebook, and whether you feel that that's the sort of information that the Oversight Board should have had access to.
Shall I answer now?
Please do, yes.
We generally don't. We issue corporate documents, and what you know about them is that a majority of the board voted for them. In this case, you're talking about one of the recommendations, and my own personal view would be, this is my personal view, and it doesn't really go to the issue of so I want to separate from the board here in a way. I think three things I would say. One is this is a sensible thing for Facebook to do. Two, I would note that because of a leak of a internal document about a week or two ago, there's some indication that Facebook itself has already has begun to conduct this, particularly about what you mentioned, the Stop the Steal undertaking, the various things related to that going back to September. Third, my concern here is that people treat this issue as a rather simple one. That is, Facebook just finds out what the bad people were doing and how you contributed to them, and then then external forces or perhaps Facebook change the algorithms and other matters. I think we should be wary of thinking that it's a morally clear and practically clear issue, because once you open up the design of the platform, you also open up the possibility of a political struggle, because what we are talking about here is the ways in which people and candidates, above all, but other people too, but candidates, the kind of audiences they reach, how big the audiences are, under what conditions. And in the United States, particularly in a situation now where you don't have a great deal of agreement about many things, that will open up the possibility of a great struggle, and also perhaps the redefinition of Facebook's design for partisan or other means. So, two kinds of affirmation in a way, and one doubt is my answer.
If I can just follow up on that. Is that, I mean, Facebook is already looking at this occasion around the Trump rally, but we know this has been a problem in the past, and there have been other leaked reports about Facebook reports looking at the amplification of extremist content. And there was a particular report looking at Germany, where I think it's the Facebook internal report said that 60% of people that have joined groups sharing extremist content have done so at the platform's recommendation. We seem to be in a situation at the moment where Facebook knows this information. Facebook has an idea of what its systems are doing to recommend extremist and harmful content to its users, but no one else does. No one else is allowed to know this information. The problem worse. But actually, shouldn't there be some authority, some body that has got the right to go in and say, actually, almost like in the case of a bank with a financial fraud, to say, okay, you failed in your obligations here. You allowed this to happen, and there were things you could. And if that event that lives, police officers hospitalised, what level of corporate responsibility should a company like Facebook take in that situation?
Well, I would point the corporate responsibility issue that is before us here of government regulation, right? And in the United States, and Facebook again is incorporated in the American state of Delaware, everything changes once the government becomes involved. If that's the actual, if Facebook, let me point out one thing. The upshot of the Trump decision was to, in a sense, stand up to Facebook and make Facebook be accountable about things. So there is public accountability, users, investors, and more generally to the political system. But if the political system tries to regulate along these lines, it's somewhat unclear, but rather likely, I think, that the First Amendment will come into play, in the sense that it hasn't been completely decided, but in the past there's been an editorial or curation kind of right that exists under the First Amendment. And to compel that, I think, would involve indeed First Amendment issues and might lead to a landmark case. In fact, I half expect a kind of landmark case of that sort about the First Amendment in the next few years if we get government regulation that controls, in some sense, the editorial work of and the other thing that will happen too is on the issues you mentioned is once the government would be involved, it might very well be the incitement standard of the United States, which I would point out is not the incitement standard in the Donald Trump case was not the American standard. It was less stringent than that. The American standard is quite stringent. So, for example, the government regulation in September, October, or even November of online content, or by implication, indirect government regulation of that content, would certainly be unconstitutional under the incitement standard in the United States. So I think the United States is unique in some ways here because of the First Amendment, but it would be very easy to fall over into the government area here. And once that happens, it's going to be very stringent on Facebook or regulation of Facebook.
I suppose my one comment on that would be, do people have First Amendment rights to have their speech boosted by the algorithms of social media? Is that a constitutional right? But they might say their piece, but do they have the right to have Facebook amplify it for them?
I think that's an open question. In part, but what hasn't been considered there is because amplification and other kinds of involves relationships between speakers and listeners. And that's a class. It's thought of as a sort of systematic thing, and you have a right to speech but not reach. But in fact, regulation might well, break up that relationship. I will say, though, that's not what I was talking about just now. The actual right at stake is not the listeners of Facebook, or excuse me, not the users of Facebook, but Facebook's editorial rights. The United States Supreme Court has recommended in newspaper cases a right to protections of editorial judgment. In Facebook, you have a curation judgment at stake. Now, that's still somewhat up in the air, but I would not be surprised if you saw a protection for Facebook's rights.
I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much in the service of time management. Thank you, John and Damian, and I'm sure we'll get back to that topic later on. But now let's turn to Michael, please.
Great, and it's a very, very stimulating conversation and a very timely one. And actually, John and Damian's back and forth in the last few minutes has really kind of teed up what I was going to say. Because it is true that historically the United States, because of the First Amendment, has taken a much more protective view of speech and has been very constraining with respect to the government. And certainly that's true as compared to Europe. So that while, for example, the US and Europe make it illegal to propagate child pornography, hate speech, which I think is more regulated in Europe than the US, is much more of an issue in the US in terms of the First Amendment. That unless you get to actual incitement, simply saying things that are hateful, or for example, Holocaust denial, would not be punishable under US law because of the First Amendment. So, one of the questions that arises as we look at the, for example, the Digital Standards Act, what the UK is thinking about doing, and what the law is in the US, is how can these be made to be symmetrical or synchronized, and to what extent is it impossible to do that? And I raise that issue against the background of the fact that we see with social media, we are dealing with a global phenomenon. And that if you have a patchwork of rules and regulations, it becomes very difficult to enforce them, partly because people can access the internet in a variety of ways from almost any place in the world. And unless you build what the Chinese have done in terms of a great firewall, it's almost impossible to police the borders in cyberspace as you would the borders in real space. So that creates an issue both in terms of the users and in terms of the platforms about the extent to which there's symmetry and to the extent to which there's asymmetry between the American view, for example, and the European view. So with that, and let me turn this to Dr. Stengg. We have seen in the U.S. in the last year or so a movement to repeal what they call Section 230, which has given very broad liability protection to the platforms. And so it does begin to look as if American lawmakers are moving more towards what Europeans are looking at, which is some form of regulation about transparency, about harmful content, and about the way in which platforms operate. And of course, to the extent we do have synchronization, that makes it easier. So Dr. Stengg, let me ask you from your perspective, what do you see as the areas that are most likely to have a common approach between Europe and the US? And what are the areas you think are most likely to be sticking points where the fundamental difference in First Amendment versus human rights in Europe may create difficulty in getting a level playing field?
Yeah, thank you very much. Very difficult question. First of all, the starting point is indeed the liability framework, which is not so different in a way as it exists today. I think there's one commonality that we, on both sides, probably we think it's not enough just to look at it from the liability standpoint. Because that was a very indirect incentive for any platform if you want to act responsibly, because it's just this indirect threat. You could also kind of ignore the liability risk that you're incurring and say, well, take me to court if you don't like what I'm doing. Whereas we are saying, well, that's probably not the response today to the challenges that we are seeing out there. And hence more the approach towards this duty of care, due diligence approach, where we would argue that platforms should have systems in place through which they more responsibly act the content that they host. So not just waiting for lawsuits to come in, but rather say, okay, we platforms are pretty much aligned, I would argue, with the public interest in saying we don't want to be a platform, that is largely abused for the dissemination of illegal content. That's also not good, even from an investor's point of view, right? In terms of trust point of view, as a platform, whether you're a marketplace or a social media company, you want to be seen these days to be acting responsibly. And that is what we're encouraging. So I think what we have in common in a way is that also in Europe, we are not, through the Digital Services Act, we are not regulating content. We are not telling a platform what type of content it has to host, for instance, or is not allowed to host. The borders is the law, right? We're just saying whatever is illegal, you have to take care of on your platform, because why should you be exempted from an obligation that applies to anyone else? But we are not going to tell Facebook that they are forced to carry certain content because we tell them to, or that they would have to remove content that is not illegal per se. So I think in that sense, we are not too far off approaches in the US, but probably others can contradict me here.
So it sounds to me like actually what you're suggesting, which makes a lot of sense, is that by focusing on fair process, transparency, a process in place to adjudicate, and internal standards that are clear, that actually is easier to synchronize with the U.S. view in the First Amendment than trying to get into specific content. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Let me ask you, Doctor, has there been an effort on the part of European officials to reach out to Americans, either at the federal or the state level, and to talk about ways in which there might be a common transatlantic approach to these issues? This comes up with the GDPR, where we've begun to see in the U.S. some of the states adopting privacy regulations that are similar to the GDPR. And of course, we've had, although there's been some back and forth with the courts, there have been some privacy agreements between the U.S. and the EU. So is there a thought of trying to actually reach out to the U.S. and get a common approach on these process issues?
Well, quite definitely. I mean, it's both. Of course, Europe is acting in its own right, or in her own right, because simply 450 million people in the last few years have been exposed to all sorts of illegal content, right? And the risks that come with it. But also that we have seen, and that's a very European phenomenon, member states, our 27 member states, would still then legislate in their own ways and say, well, the German citizens are exposed to hate speech, so let's have a German law against Facebook. And then the French would have a similar approach. So if Europe as a whole does not act, that still doesn't mean that we're not acting at all, but that may mean that we act in 27 different ways. And that's probably the worst that can happen to any global or pan-European business, if you want, right? So we are doing what we think has to be done, both to protect the citizen, but also to protect the market, if you want, yeah? Now, already in December last year, we came out with our ideas for a new transatlantic partnership. And we said, well, the digital world is one obvious example of where we want and need to work closely together with our American friends. Because even though the global internet is showing some different approaches, yeah, if you mentioned the Chinese approach, American approach, European approach, we would still argue that we are so much like-minded continents, yeah, US and Europe. So of course we have similar principles. We may have some divergences and differences in ideas here and there, but overall, we are like-minded. So we want to discuss digital with Americans, whether that's now artificial intelligence, where we just put also draft legislation on the table, whether it is the Digital Services Act, platform regulation. Quite obviously, what we want to discuss thoroughly, and work has really started on this, not on the ground, but politically. President Biden and President von der Leyen have already talked a few weeks ago. and as soon as structures are stable, those discussions will be held. And obviously, I would see at the end of the road a lot of mutual recognition type of arrangements or adequacy type of arrangements to make sure we're on the same page.
Can I add something? Can I add something to that? Just to agree absolutely that an international approach is obviously the best way of doing this if we possibly can. But I think those of us who are trying to formulate policy in this at a national level really have a choice to make. You either wait until you've got to a point where there's international consensus, everyone has agreed, everyone has chosen the same path, and we go forward in lockstep together, which realistically, desirable though it is, would take an extraordinarily long time to get to. Or I think you take the approach of saying we have to design a national approach. We want to make sure that that national approach, just as Dr. Stengg says, coordinates, synchronizes with the national approach, international approach being taken elsewhere. But you can't, I think, wait forever for the international consensus before you take action of any kind. And that's why I think it's right that each individual nation state moves forward, or the EU moves forward with what it proposes to do, but we try and synchronize later. And just on Section 230, I mean, I think there's a danger in this debate of being hung up on the divisions that you might establish between whether these platforms are platforms or whether they're publishers, whether they take responsibility in a publisher type sense for what they are promulgating. I don't think you need to go there. I think you need to have a broader understanding of the concept of responsibility. And it comes to systems, not individual pieces of content, for all the reasons that have been given, but also for the most obvious, which is that there is so much content out there. If we tasked a regulator, any regulator, with the job of dealing with each individual piece of content, it would be utterly overwhelmed. So this has to be based on systems, and systems that we test through our regulators to make sure that they are doing all they reasonably can to keep users safe. And I think that is something that we can expect platforms to do, and that it goes exactly to the points Damian was making around not just promulgation, but amplification. If that's what your system is doing, you're going to have to persuade a regulator that that is a way in which you are complying with the duty of care to keep your users safe. And you may find that difficult to do. It isn't about individual pieces of content. It's about the system you use to regulate the content on your platform. That's what a regulator should be judging.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I'm going to surrender the floor in a moment, but I do think something we ought to talk about a little bit later is the particular challenge posed by algorithms. I mean, in many ways, the disinformation issue we see online is not terribly different from some of the disinformation we see in the conventional media, which has also become a platform in some respects for disinformation, at least in the US. But the difference is that with social media, it's often possible to target individual listeners by using the data which is generated through their online activities. And that creates a special challenge. So with that, Tanit, let me turn it back over to you.
Could I make a point about Mr. Wright's comment?
Sure, you can.
I think it's important. It is the systematic approaches has been recently discussed in an article widely read here in the United States. And one can see the logic of it. But there's also a way of looking at things that I think is important and has been important to me at the Oversight Board, which is to recognize that harm is indeed at stake. And in part, of course, that is the harm done by speech. Speech is not absolute. However, we should also recognize and keep in mind, and often I think in these discussions it drops out, is that profound harms can be done by regulators, by the Facebook Oversight Board, by Facebook itself, more likely. And it's precisely because of the systematic quality. I mean, Facebook's kinds of filters, or its kind of the way it goes about it, can create massive false positives that are just costs to free speech. And it is a true balancing, though, not just a tunnel vision on the harms done by speech, but that the potential harm to democracy itself, to liberal democracy, that can be done by regulators and by private entities like Facebook.
Which is fair. And sorry, Tanit, if I just say, I mean, I think that is absolutely fair. But the balancing act that we've all been discussing is exactly what has to be applied by a regulator in these circumstances. We have to set a legislative framework for a regulator to work within, and we have to make it clear that part of the objectives of a regulator is to promote freedom of speech, to ensure that all those democratic imperatives are met. And in some circumstances, to explain to the regulator, if you're Facebook, for example, why you have not decided in the systems you apply to restrict certain kinds of speech. But I don't think that that leads us to the conclusion that regulation and the existence of a regulator is a bad thing. It points up the challenge of ensuring that your regulation is balanced.
I do
Let
think
me,
that
let me jump in here, John, just because
Sure.
we've only got 15 minutes left, and we shouldn't just make this, I think, about Facebook simply because we have a member of the Facebook Oversight Board here. There's a wonderful phrase I recently heard, which is don't mistake your country with your Twitter feed. So of course we're not just talking about Facebook, we're also talking about Twitter, we're talking about Google and YouTube, obviously. And I like the remark Michael just made earlier that traditional independent media have their share of responsibility as well. I'm not going into sort of our share in disinformation because I think we slightly disagree, at least when it comes to European media. But of course, traditional media and independent media have a share in amplifying what is happening in a sometimes secluded social media space by taking it on to mass media. So I think that's part of the responsibility we should address as well as journalists, because I'm as an optimist, I'm pretty sure that our countries aren't as polarized as social media platforms or algorithms make them out to be. So I'm usually based in Berlin. Of course, you all know the NetzDG, and what I'd like to talk to Jeremy about is how sort of there's a difference between the British online harms bill in regard to the NetzDG. So the German law has been criticized for sort of putting the onus completely on platforms to determine whether any given post is illegal online in the same way as it would be illegal offline. And interestingly, we've had a couple of court cases where judges, at least on the lower courts, failed to actually rule what was illegal content. So you might wonder how Facebook can do it if even German judges cannot. But in what way does your online harms bill differ from this approach of putting responsibility solely on the backs of platforms to set the boundaries?
Well, I think it goes back to the conversation we've been having about the way in which you expect a regulator to operate. And I think in terms of illegal content, and there is a distinction in what's likely to come out as UK legislation between illegal content and lawful but harmful content. And so far as illegal content is concerned, I think what we would want is the same thing as what we would want for lawful but harmful content, which is that there's an interactive conversation between a platform and its regulator. And that may sound like a terribly naive thing to say, but I do think it's possible. And I would say that actually, when it comes to broadcast media, print media, the regulation that happens of broadcast media in the UK is by Ofcom, who will be the regulator for online as well. And the interaction between Ofcom and, for example, broadcast media is pretty good. And there is an opportunity to say, if you are regulated, I am not sure what the appropriate response is to the thing that is in front of me. So I will go and speak to the regulator and I will say, what do you think? If I do X, would that be, in your view, the appropriate response? If I did Y, would that be an appropriate response? That kind of interaction is the kind of thing we should expect, I think, a sensible regulator to do with the organizations that it is regulating. And if, therefore, there is confusion, let's try and resolve that confusion by a discussion between regulator and regulated before it ever gets to an enforcement stage. I don't think, speaking as a criminal lawyer by background, that there is all too often very much confusion about what is criminal and what is not. I think the confusion comes, and the difficult part comes, when we're talking about lawful but harmful content. That is absolutely where definitions matter, and where legislators and regulators have to be very clear in their definitions so that everybody knows where they stand. There may be challenges in being able to identify individual pieces of, for example, unlawful child pornography content. But frankly, the concept of what is unlawful versus what is lawful is not, I think, where our problem lies in the UK. I mean, I think on the NetzDG laws, obviously, a lot of this has been about how quickly you expect platforms to take the content down and the consequences if they don't take it down quickly enough. So again, I think there's a lot of learning everybody can do from everyone else's experiences. And what I hope the UK government will do is look around the world at what has been done and make sure we learn the appropriate lessons from it. The UK approach is going to be quite different, though, to what's been tried elsewhere, because it is far more comprehensive. And I think you can only approach a comprehensive system of regulation effectively if you are giving some discretion to your regulator to act appropriate in each individual circumstance. So a bit of trust between regulator and regulated is going to be necessary.
There is criticism saying that by restricting your plans to regulate disinformation and misinformation in the way that it's sort of restricted to misinformation that causes significant harm to an individual, you're sort of exempting the disinformation that is damaging democracy. So if you take, for instance, spreading false rumors about election fraud, as we've seen in the US, this could, of course, undermine trust in the voting system. So would you say that's a shortcoming of the current bill?
Yes, I would. I think it is going to be necessary for us to look very carefully at whether or not the definitions of harm are too restrictive. I entirely understand the concern that the platforms will have legitimately, that if you're not clear about what it is they're supposed to do, they will find it very difficult to do it. I think that's a fair comment. But I also think that if you are too restrictive in the way in which you define harm, you will miss a large piece of what people are understandably concerned about. And disinformation is not just something that damages an individual. It can, as you say, damage a democracy, or democracy as a concept, and also damage groups of individuals. And I think if you are too restrictive in the way in which you define harm, you will simply end up missing a great deal of what this bill and this regulatory approach should cover. My answer, I have to say, to those who say, well, how are you going to make sure that this doesn't go too far, doesn't reach too widely, is to rely on my favorite word, reasonably, and to say that in the end, you have to recognize that certain things are unrealistic expectations of any platform, however hard it is trying. You cannot expect a platform to exclude every element of harmful content. And you could not expect, for example, the same of a very small platform as you could of a very large one. So all of these are discretions that I think regulators should be given. But I don't accept that defining down the way in which harm is described in the way that which the government, I think, currently intends to do in this bill is the right way to do it, because just as you say, we will miss some of the big harms that people are justifiably concerned about.
Well, let me just chime in here, because I think what Jeremy says is very interesting, and I think maybe we need to take a somewhat broader view of harms, particularly as it relates to disinformation. But I would say also, let's be mindful that even the regulators can abuse the idea of harm. I'll give you a concrete example. I mean, we all agree that totally false news is not a value we want to protect. But at least until last November or last January, we had a president of the United States who believed that any news that made him look bad was fake. And that if he had the power to regulate that, or if his assistants did, we would be living in a very different country. So one of the things I think we've learned looking around the world in the last few years is that the norms of behavior that we've come to expect from our government officials may not always be observed by some government officials. And so we need to build a rule that is both comprehensive enough, but also has guardrails against abuse by people who are not sharing our norms.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think two things are important about regulators. One, they have to be independent. That means independent of everybody in the political spectrum. Two, they have to be appealable. There has to be a way of challenging the decision a regulator makes, just in case the regulator's got it wrong. Now, these are all delicate balances, and we have to, as I say, as legislators, we have to set out the legislative framework within which a regulator operates. But in the end, a regulator's judgment has to be preserved as independent to avoid just what you're describing. But we also have to account for the fact that mistakes could be made and they need to be corrected. So some form of appeal mechanism is also essential.
John, I think you wanted to comment.
Yeah, I listening to this, I can't help but recall that I don't think in the United States I've ever met a person, left or right, who didn't believe not only that those who opposed them were mistaken or got the facts wrong, but were actually just lying about it, right? This was an early lesson I learned at the Cato Institute. That and the whole other side of this, which I think perhaps is more American than European, the problem of public choice, the problem of government not pursuing the welfare, general welfare, but pursuing a more partisan or narrow. And you certainly do have to have protections against that. And the United States Supreme Court is one, and it does it by having a very broad notion of incitement. And I might also say, telling falsehoods is not protected by the First Amendment.
Damian, would you like, as you're sort of an expert on both the European and UK approach, and of course, looking at the US as well, would you like to comment?
Well, I mean, just listening to the comments that were made, I think we have to recognise that in terms of like incitement, social media creates a new sort of a problem, because in the Supreme Court Brandenburg case, there's a case of a man said something that was recorded by a television camera that may have caused a credible, imminent risk to illegal activity taking place. With social media, it could well be that trying to look for an individual post that has done that is maybe the wrong thing to look at. Saying, what is the effect of a constant drumbeat of the reassertion of a mistruth or something harmful, something that may incite people to behave in a discriminatory or prejudiced way against other people? What is the consequence of that over a long period of time, over many months or even many years? What is the role of social media in the rise we're seeing in the Western world in levels of self-harm amongst young girls, of race-motivated crimes, and increasing levels of hate speech? We've seen a really interesting demonstration this year of the power of social media to help shape views around the coronavirus and its vaccine and its causes. In something new that's come along that's not a party political issue. It's not about left or right. It's just about people trying to access information and their ability to be influenced by what they see. I think this is a different sort of a problem, and that's why I certainly feel that the sort of regulatory approach that I think in the UK we're trying to set out through the Online Safety Bill, similar to the EU's Digital Services Act as well, is to say we need institutions that can take a balanced view, that can actually say, are the systems of these companies being used to make harm worse, to spread harm? Is that influencing people's actions and behaviours, and is it responsible? In the same way, in most other industries, we seek to regulate business practices, and I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that that's principally what we're talking about. That we're not talking about seeking to regulate citizen speech. We're talking about the need to regulate business practices that are there and have been designed to make money for the companies that operate them. Facebook has a business model around engagement. It directs content at people. It thinks that it will engage them, and it makes money out of that while holding their attention and selling ads against it. And so I'm very sympathetic to what people like Bruce Reed, the new White House Deputy Chief of Staff, said. That, if it's something a company's making money out of, it's something that company could be regulated for. And I think John's comment earlier on as well about the editorial function that social media companies play in selecting, ranking, boosting content, I think is absolutely right. And for me, although this is about American law, it sits ill with Section 230 and the idea that platforms are neutral, that they are merely the conduit of other people's content. They clearly influence the way that content is distributed and shared, and who sees it and how frequently. And therefore, I think that's a legitimate area for regulation. And whilst I don't, with the Facebook Oversight Board, although I think it's right that the people should question the editorial decisions that Facebook make on individual bits of content, we don't yet have a system that allows us to regulate the systems or even understand how they work. So
thank you, Damian. I think we've got about a minute and a half left, and I'd just like to hear from Werner, who didn't have as much speech time as many others in this round, to hear his very brief thoughts on how the EU is going forward, looking at what the UK is doing, looking at what the US is doing, and regarding to what Jeremy said earlier, that you can't wait sort of for a global system to work. Is the EU going to sort of take on shared best practices by the UK, for instance, or the US? Brief answer, please.
Yeah, well, I think we have been looking into all these systems all the time. You know, the DSA didn't fall from the sky, but we have been working for years and consulting widely and so on. So I think we have tried to take in all the good elements that we could find. I think what is important really going forward is to distinguish between the individual and how you protect the individual whose content may be affected, right? Werner Stengg uploads something, Facebook takes it down, or Twitter. How will I be informed? How can I react? How can I complain? And then the other debate is really how do we dealing with the risks to democracy, more widely speaking? What systems check do we have in place? What transparency do we need? What accountability mechanisms do we need for platforms really to demonstrate to us that they do take measures to reduce any systemic risk that they may be posing to society? And I think these are the things that I think both of us on both sides of the Atlantic would share, that we may not always totally agree on every comma, but I think that is the direction of travel where we should be able to agree.
Wonderful, Werner. Thank you very much. Brilliant last words. Thank you all in alphabetical order, Damian, Jeremy, John, and Werner. I'll now hand over to our next session and Jean. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts.